Welcome to Making the Shift. Today we're talking all about how we can support non-speaking autistic children. And I will tell you, this idea for the episode came to me after a couple of calls that happened within a day or two in my clinic. As a lot of you know, I own a speech clinic here in Los Angeles, and I do all of the intake calls for new families. And in the same week, I had a couple of families call who had such a similar story. And one, I'll tell you, for example, was a dad calling. He said, my 4-year-old is nonverbal and he's autistic, and we want to get him some extra speech therapy. You know, he's in class, he is on an IEP. And I said, okay, so is he using any AAC? And the dad said, what's that? And to me, that was just so heartbreaking because this child is already in school, already, on an IEP, and already has all of these supports in place, but no one had thought to, introduce him to AAC. So today, something we really just want to talk about is how can we best support non-speaking children? We're going to give you a few of our best tips on places to get started. And I also thought a good place to start would be talking about the difference between the word nonverbal and non-speaking, and why we default to using the word non-speaking.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with that too. I see a lot on social media too, and within comments, nonverbal being used a lot. And so this is just for educational purposes, for, learning some alternative ways to change language, but perceptions, and how that helps guide goals and the process to help others. That's really the ultimate thing. So it's not to say, hey, you need to stop saying this or stop saying that. It's more of a, here's just a different way of looking at it. Here's a different way of using language, so that way we can get the right supports in place.
Mm-hmm. And I posted about this recently. I said, here's why you should use the term non-speaking instead of nonverbal. And some people just went nuts. Like, some people were in the comments just saying, this doesn't matter, but it does matter. And when a community comes together and tells you, hey, this is how we prefer to be addressed, we need to listen to that community. It's not our decision to call them what we want. It's up to them to tell us, here's what makes me comfortable. So let's talk about why.
I didn't even see that, by the way. I didn't know that. You didn't share that with me, but yeah, I mean, just to double down on what I just mentioned is interesting, because although it just seems like a subtle change, the reality is that the language that we use can really help drive the reports that we write, the therapy that we use, the discussions that we have, the perceptions of people. And that's why it's important. It really might seem like such a surface level thing. So we'll dive into it.
Yeah. And, a lot of people, what people will say is that the word nonverbal implies non-communicative. And there's such a, negative connotation associated with the word nonverbal. And it's the assumptions we make about a child when we hear they're nonverbal. And it's whether or not you mean it. Like, when you are saying, oh, this kid's nonverbal, you're probably not trying to say he's not smart and he doesn't understand anything you say, but that's how another person oftentimes perceives it.
Yeah, like nonverbal can sometimes come across to people as not having language, and that's just not the case. I came by a comment that is by an autistic individual. Her name's Jordan Pallet, and she said this. I think this really resonates. So she said, nonverbal brings forth a slew of assumptions about me that are entirely inaccurate, including lack of understanding language, aggressive behavior, lack of emotional intelligence, and cognitive impairment. I prefer non-speaking, as it is a short description that encapsulates who I am more accurately. It also makes people stop and think instead of relying on what they know about me based on what they observe. And I think that's really an important thing, because again, if people are just making assumptions based on what they observe without truly knowing what's going on for that person's situation, then can drive the wrong types of goals and the wrong types of therapy approaches and the ways that we support others.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might be sitting here thinking, but why is a child non-speaking, or why is this adult non-speaking? And there can be a lot of reasons. And the truth is, we may not even know or be able to identify the specific reason. But I'll tell you, what I see very often in the clinic are usually a child has trouble motor planning and has it's a lot easier for them to communicate, moving their fingers, pointing to pictures, or touching buttons on their device than it is to form words orally. Or, dysregulation plays a major factor in whether or not people are able to, speak and access their language. But just having the right communication system in place. But the thing we have to think about is that kids, and I'm sure this conversation goes beyond kids, but I'm just so used to talking about kids, and that's kind of my area, so I'll speak to kids. But kids are always going to do what is easier and more convenient for them. So oftentimes we'll introduce something like a device to a child, and we might have a parent say, well, I don't want them relying on this device and never speaking, right? But the truth is that if it was easy and convenient for the child to speak, that's how they would communicate more often than the device. So the device just opens up a world where they can have access to more language and more communication than they did before. So let's talk about, maybe you can give some examples. A lot of people listening are familiar with AAC, but for maybe parents who are here and don't know what that is, why don't you tell
everyone? Break down the term AAC. Yeah, augmentative and alternative communication. So where we are augmenting communication, supporting it. And so if somebody's wanting to speak, we can communicate our needs through a variety of ways other than just having to use our mouth, like verbal speech, right? So that could come in the form of writing down something in the Notes app on your iPhone and then communicating that. It can come from an app on an iPad and having that as a communication tool with a variety of icons. It could come from a communication book or a flip book with a variety of ways to advocate and share interest and make comments. It can come from gestures and being able to point, or having somebody point and to something that they're wanting to eat, or pointing to the water bottle if they're thirsty. Like there's just a variety and an alternative way of communicating, and all of those being valid ways to get one's needs met and to connect with others.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I should say, a myth that introducing kids to AAC will hinder development of speech and language. We only see that introducing them to alternative ways to communicate builds their speech and language. And we start in our clinic from such an early age. And that's why, like, you might be sitting there listening to that story of a dad with a 4-year-old. And to me, that's such a gut punch, because that's years past when I would have loved to get an AAC device or some form of a way to communicate or system into that child's hands. And it's really never too early. So it's only ever going to help speech. You may have seen video we posted recently where we have an AAC at our house. We use it with our 15-month-old. And, that's only because it will help him. So that is piece of advice number one, is it's never too early to start, and it's never too late to start. We just had a friend reach out who wanted their 20-something-year-old client to consult with us about starting to use AAC, because to her, verbal speech was just so draining and took so much out of her that she was looking for an alternative means to communicate. Okay, so it's never too early. I have
Right. There's no prerequisites when it comes to like this perception on cognition. You start early, you presume that the person and the individual is capable of learning the language. The nice thing about it is that when we provide access to a means of communicating, as Jesse mentioned, that facilitates further language development and fosters that ability to also support spoken communication. And there's research to back that as well, which is what I have found in my practice. The more that I work with students and help them, the more oftentimes more than not, their student will just feel regulated and comfortable enough to, just verbally speaking the words at times.
Yeah. So what you just said, I would say that's number two for sure is presume competence. So, we never want to make assumptions about kids, because when we assume, oh, he'll never be able to pick up on this, or it's too far beyond what he's capable of, then we don't even give them the opportunity to try. And, we've just been shocked by some of the success we will see with kids, even from an early age. I was just in our waiting room last week, and we have a family here whose son is 2, and we started using an AAC with him when he started, I don't know, maybe like 6 months ago or something like that. And I was in the waiting room, and his mom was like, oh my gosh, so he just started saying these words and he just started counting, and those were the first words he had used. And I said to her, like, it's all you, because he had this little, he's so tiny, so they had this little mini um, iPad or whatever kind of device it is that's so tiny that he can carry. And we introduced it, and mom said, what is that program? And can I download it? And how can I work on it at home? And can his teachers work on it when he's at preschool? And it's like she had the whole team on board. And that's how progress is made. And that's how language is developed. And it was just so cool to see, because I think it's one of those things where we don't always see the immediate impact. Sometimes it takes some time for kids. And yeah, so that was a cool thing, even at 2 years old.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that when we talk about presuming competence, or, taking on the assumption that there's a lot of capacity to learn and build language and think and process, that even comes down to the first thing we said, which is the difference between using nonverbal and non-speaking. I think that just right off the bat, we're not presuming competence if we're saying nonverbal, because that implies that the person doesn't have language, that they're not capable of thinking or learning the language. And that's just not accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. So last but not least, and you will not be surprised to hear me say this, is that one way we can support non-speaking autistic children is by supporting their regulation. And, we know how the brain works. It's neurology. When we're dysregulated, we really struggle with accessing our language. And that prevents us from being able to learn and engage in activities the way that we want to. So we know that, most autistic kids have sensory differences, and we need to figure out what those are. Because if we have a child who's coming into a classroom, and say this child is sensitive to sound, and say they're sensitive to touch and visuals, and they walk into this classroom and it's like the busiest place with all these kids walking around, and they're bumping into him constantly, and there's pictures on every wall, and it's loud, and kids are screaming, there's a bell, and there's chairs screeching, and there's lights buzzing. I mean, classrooms are so peaceful, aren't they? Right? But this child can be so overstimulated in this classroom that they're just not in an environment that is going to support their language development, because their body is in fight or flight. Their body is thinking, I gotta get out of here, or I gotta shut down, I gotta keep myself safe. And that is going to be such a barrier to language. But when we can try to be more proactive with our kids' regulation needs, and try to set up environments so that they are more comfortable and their sensory needs are accommodated, that's when we see massive growth in learning and in language.
Yeah, and that's
mic drop.
Boom. That's it. She's walked off the stage.
Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Come back, Jessie. She's gone with the wind. But yeah, I second that.
Yeah.
That's all I was going
So
to say.
I hope this helps. When we just really wanted to put an episode out there so that no matter where you are on your journey, whether you're supporting your own child or kids that you work with who are non-speaking, you can think about, here are some ways that I can make a really big impact. And that is by introducing AAC even from an early age, presuming competence, supporting their regulation. And of course, those are just a few things that we can do, but we found that those are really powerful and meaningful.
Bada bing, bada boom.
So thanks for being here, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Bye, everyone.